The White House briefing room holds 49 seats. 47 were filled when the Chief of Staff entered at 3:17 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, not through the side door used by press secretaries and junior staff, but through the main door behind the podium, the door reserved for the president and cabinet-level officials. He was not scheduled to appear. The daily press briefing had ended 40 minutes earlier. The room had mostly cleared, but a handful of reporters remained, filing stories, reviewing footage, waiting for the occasional stray official who might offer background context. When the Chief of Staff walked in, the conversation stopped. Phones were set down, laptop screens were turned. He carried a single manila folder and a pen. He walked directly to the podium without acknowledging anyone in the room. He placed the folder down, gripped both edges of the lectern, and stared at the camera mounted at the back of the room for approximately 8 seconds. Then he picked up the folder, turned, and walked back through the door without speaking. No statement was read. No questions were taken. No explanation was offered. The entire sequence, from entry to exit, lasted 34 seconds. The reporters in the room sat motionless for several seconds after he left. Then one shouted a question toward the closed door. No one answered. Another tried to follow him into the hallway. A Secret Service officer stepped into the doorway and closed it before anyone could pass. Within minutes, the footage was uploaded to networks and wire services. Within an hour, it was the lead story on every major news website. Not because of what was said, but because nothing was said. A senior White House official had walked to the podium with prepared notes in the middle of an otherwise quiet afternoon and then left without reading them. The silence was louder than any statement could have been. The context required to understand that silence had been building for 11 days. 11 days earlier, Canada had suspended 30% of its electricity exports to the northeastern United States in response to a 25% American tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. The suspension was described as necessary maintenance. The maintenance had no published end date. American consumers in 4 states were now paying 11 to 14% more for electricity. 6 lumber mills had closed. 2,100 workers had been laid off. The president had responded with escalation: a 35% tariff on Canadian steel, a threat to suspend visa-free travel for Canadian citizens, a formal review of all existing defense cooperation agreements. Each measure was announced via social media or press release. None were delivered through diplomatic channels. Canada responded to each one not with counter-escalation, but with subtraction. Rare earth mineral exports to American defense contractors were delayed due to export licensing reviews. Pharmaceutical precursor chemicals normally shipped to American manufacturers were rerouted to European buyers due to supply chain optimization. Natural gas pipeline capacity was reduced by 18% due to infrastructure assessments. Each Canadian action was described in bureaucratic language. Each was reversible. Each caused immediate, measurable, and politically visible damage. And each was announced through routine regulatory channels, not through press conferences or dramatic statements. The asymmetry was surgical. The United States was escalating loudly. Canada was de-escalating quietly, but the quiet de-escalation was more damaging than the loud escalation. By the 10th day, internal White House polling showed that approval ratings in affected regions had dropped 14 points. Congressional offices in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York were receiving between 400 and 700 constituent calls per day, nearly all expressing frustration with rising electricity costs and mill closures. Republican lawmakers who had previously supported aggressive trade tactics were now publicly requesting recalibration. Democratic lawmakers were calling for hearings. The political cost of the standoff was compounding daily. On the 11th day, the president convened an emergency meeting in the Roosevelt Room. Present were the Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Commerce, the Director of the National Economic Council, and the Special Envoy, who had walked out of the Ottawa negotiation 11 minutes into a scheduled 2-hour session. The meeting was scheduled for 1 hour. It lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. No official minutes were released, but 4 separate sources with knowledge of the discussion have provided overlapping accounts. The meeting opened with a presentation from the Director of the National Economic Council, outlining the cumulative economic impact of Canada's response measures. The electricity cost increase was costing consumers $2 billion annually. The mill closures had eliminated $140 million in annual payroll. The rare earth mineral delays were affecting $1 billion in defense contracts. The pharmaceutical precursor shortages were disrupting production lines for 7 major generic drug manufacturers. The president interrupted the presentation repeatedly, insisting the numbers were exaggerated, that Canada would capitulate within days, that the American economy could absorb the costs indefinitely. The director of the National Economic Council responded that the economy could absorb the costs, but the voters in affected districts could not, and that those voters would determine whether the House remained Republican in 18 months. The Secretary of State suggested a diplomatic off-ramp. A quiet bilateral meeting. No preconditions. No prepared demands. A genuine negotiation. The president rejected the suggestion immediately, stating that requesting a meeting would signal weakness and that Canada needed to request the meeting first. The chief of staff, who had remained silent for the first 90 minutes, then asked a question. He did not raise his voice. He did not challenge the president directly. He simply asked, "If Canada does not request a meeting, what is the plan?" The room went quiet. The president did not answer immediately. He looked at the National Security Advisor. The National Security Advisor looked at the Secretary of Commerce. The Secretary of Commerce looked at the Special Envoy. The Special Envoy said nothing. After 18 seconds of silence, the president said, "They will request a meeting. They have no choice." The Chief of Staff responded with one sentence, "Sir, we are now on day 11. They have not requested a meeting. They have not signaled willingness to request a meeting. They have instead systematically reduced every category of export that causes immediate political pain in swing districts. What is the plan if they continue not requesting a meeting?" The president stood and left the room. The meeting was over. No plan was articulated. No decision was made. No directive was issued. The senior officials present remained seated for approximately 40 seconds after the president exited. Then they collected their materials and left in silence. At 2:45 p.m., 30 minutes after the Roosevelt Room meeting ended, the chief of staff received a call from a Republican congressman whose district includes two of the shuttered lumber mills. The congressman did not request a favor. He did not ask for clarification. He delivered a message. He said, "I have 6 town halls scheduled over the next 2 weeks. I will be asked at every single one why my constituents are paying more for electricity and why 2 mills that employed 900 people are closed. I need to give them an answer that is not, 'The president is waiting for Canada to apologize.' If I cannot give them that answer, I will lose my seat. If I lose my seat, you lose the House. I need the answer by Friday." The chief of staff did not respond immediately. Then he said, "I understand." The congressman said, "I don't think you do. This is not a request. This is a notification. I am one of 14 members in similar districts having identical conversations with their chiefs of staff today. We are not asking for permission. We are telling you the clock has run out." At 3:10 p.m., the chief of staff walked to the Oval Office. He carried a 2-page memo he had drafted after the Roosevelt Room meeting ended. The memo outlined 3 options. Option 1, publicly request a meeting with Canada, framed as a mutual de-escalation. Option 2, quietly signal through diplomatic back channels that the United States was prepared to lift the softwood tariff in exchange for restoration of electricity exports. Option 3, continue the current strategy and accept the loss of 12 to 18 House seats in affected districts. He presented the memo to the president. The president read it in silence. Then he said, "We are not requesting a meeting. We are not signaling anything. They will break first." The chief of staff asked, "And if they do not?" The president did not answer. The chief of staff waited 22 seconds. Then he said, "Sir, I need authorization to make a statement to the press outlining our strategy. The current silence is being interpreted as confusion. I need to provide clarity." The president handed the memo back to him and said, "Tell them we are monitoring the situation and will respond appropriately." The chief of staff looked at the memo in his hand. He looked at the president. He said, "That is not a strategy. That is a delay." The president turned back to the desk and picked up his phone. The meeting was over. At 3:17 p.m., the chief of staff walked into the briefing room. He carried the memo in a manila folder. He had written 3 paragraphs of prepared remarks outlining the administration's position. The remarks acknowledged the economic costs, framed the standoff as necessary to protect long-term American interests, and promised resolution within 30 days. The remarks were carefully calibrated to signal strength without closing off future negotiation. He stood at the podium. He placed the folder down. He looked at the cameras. And then he realized that every word in the folder was a lie. There was no strategy. There was no plan. There was no resolution coming in 30 days. There was only a president who believed Canada would capitulate because he needed them to capitulate, and a chief of staff who knew they would not. He could not read a statement promising a plan that did not exist. He could not reassure the public when he himself had just asked for a strategy and been told to monitor the situation. He could not stand at the podium of the White House and lie to the American people about a policy that had no endgame. So he picked up the folder and walked out. Laura McKenzie is a 16-year senior policy advisor at a Washington think tank that specializes in trade dynamics and North American relations. Her job is to brief congressional staffers, corporate executives, and occasionally mid-level administration officials on emerging trends in cross-border economic policy. She has testified before Senate committees 4 times. She has authored 2 books on NAFTA and its successor agreements. She is not prone to hyperbole. 3 hours after the chief of staff walked out of the briefing room, she received calls from 7 different congressional offices asking the same question in 7 different ways. The question was this: what does it mean when the White House cannot articulate a position? Her answer was identical in each call. She said, it means the position does not exist. And when the position does not exist, the other side knows it does not exist. And when the other side knows your position does not exist, they stop negotiating and start waiting. By evening, the footage of the Chief of Staff's 34-second non-statement had been viewed 14 million times. Cable news networks ran it on loop. Political analysts offered competing interpretations. Some framed it as strategic ambiguity, others framed it as internal chaos. A former White House communications director from a previous administration appeared on 3 separate programs and said the same thing each time. That was not strategy. That was a man who walked to the podium, realized he had nothing true to say, and chose silence over dishonesty. That is not leadership. That is collapse in real time. The Canadian response came not from the Prime Minister, not from the Foreign Minister, not from any senior official. It came from a mid-level spokesperson at Global Affairs Canada during a routine press availability in Ottawa. A reporter asked whether Canada had seen the footage of the American Chief of Staff walking out of the briefing room without speaking. The spokesperson said, "We have seen it. We have no comment." The reporter followed up, asking whether Canada interpreted the silence as a signal of anything. The spokesperson paused, then said this: "We interpret actions, not silence." That phrase was repeated in 19 different news stories within 6 hours. It was translated into French, German, Spanish, Mandarin, and Japanese. It trended on social media in 22 countries. It became the diplomatic equivalent of a shrug, but the shrug contained a message. Canada was no longer watching what Washington said. Canada was watching what Washington did, and what Washington was doing was nothing. The next morning, electricity costs in Vermont increased another 6% as grid operators activated additional backup generation capacity to compensate for the ongoing Canadian maintenance suspension. A lumber mill in Maine that had announced a 90-day temporary closure updated its status to permanent shutdown, eliminating 310 jobs. A pharmaceutical manufacturer in New Jersey announced production delays on a generic blood pressure medication due to precursor chemical shortages, affecting approximately 1.2 million prescriptions. The White House issued no comment on any of these developments. The Chief of Staff did not return to the briefing room. The President posted twice on social media, both times repeating that Canada would come crawling back and that we hold all the cards. Neither post addressed the mill closures, the electricity costs, or the pharmaceutical delays. In the Roosevelt Room, the 2-page memo the Chief of Staff had drafted remained on the table where it had been left after the emergency meeting. No one had picked it up. No one had acted on it. It simply sat there, a document outlining 3 options, none of which had been chosen. George Marshall, in his memoirs published in 1976, recounted a moment during the Berlin airlift when President Truman asked him how long the United States could sustain the operation. Marshall responded with a question: how long can we sustain not sustaining it? Truman understood immediately. The cost of action was high. The cost of inaction was collapse. Once that calculation is understood, the decision makes itself. The Chief of Staff understood that calculation when he stood at the podium. The cost of reading the memo was lying to the public about a strategy that did not exist. The cost of not reading the memo was admitting through silence that no strategy existed. He chose the latter, not because it was better, but because it was honest. And honesty, in that moment, was the only option that did not require him to participate in a deception he knew would fail. By week's end, internal White House polling showed approval ratings in affected states had dropped another 11 points. 22 Republican congressional offices had now sent formal requests to the White House for a clear articulation of trade policy objectives and timelines. The requests were polite in tone but unambiguous in message. The current approach was politically unsustainable. No clear articulation was provided. No timeline was offered. The silence that began at the podium spread into a vacuum that consumed the entire policy apparatus. Staff meetings were scheduled and then postponed. Interagency working groups were convened and then disbanded. Draft proposals were circulated and then ignored. The machinery of government was still running, but it was no longer moving forward. It was idling in place, waiting for direction that never came. The Chief of Staff had walked to the podium with a folder containing a statement. The statement contained 3 paragraphs. The paragraphs contained 340 words. Those words represented the last remaining effort to construct a coherent narrative around a policy that had no foundation. When he walked away without reading them, he was not abandoning strategy. He was admitting that no strategy remained to abandon. The folder is still in his office. The memo is still on the table in the Roosevelt Room. The briefing room podium stands empty most afternoons now because no one is willing to stand behind it and explain what cannot be explained. And in Ottawa, the lights are still on, the electricity is still reduced by 30%, and the Canadian government is still waiting. Not for an apology, not for a concession, just for an acknowledgement that the United States has finally realized what the Chief of Staff realized when he turned and walked away. You cannot negotiate when you have no position. You cannot lead when you have no plan. And you cannot stand at a podium and read words you know are not true. The silence said everything the words could not. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.